Hello, ladies and gents. Happy Monday the 2nd. It's Monday today, isn't it? Absolutely. Happy Monday the 2nd of January. It's Justin Johnson. We're getting back to my academic integrity, which is arts and humanities, history and politics. I want to influence the youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. People think, why should OAPs study? You can't tether your life and keep yourself methodical. You don't want to be counting down your last days of living. So let's keep your mind focused, keep your mind methodical. Have a vision, set sights. Anyway, investigating the social world too. One module DD 103. Always read the referencing of the reading. Edited by Deborah H. Drake, Andy Morris, Alan Shipman, and Katie Willer. We're going to see where the book was published to make sure the tutor is knowing where you're reading your work from, your reference. I know the book was printed at Open University. Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, MK7 6AA, first published in 2015. That's very important to make sure it's issued and published on the same day. It was copyrighted at the Open University. So here we go anyway. Introduction. The first part of this book investigates a range of contemporary, global and common resources. Such as resources include forests, oceans and the atmosphere, all of which are being consumed or exploited at a rate that threatens their stability as well as that of the wider environment. Impact of human beings on the environment and relationship between human populations and common resources is contested on the often fraught area. I mean, we're talking about the environment. Talking about common resources. Obviously, depletion of land is a big factor, isn't it? With overpopulation, and we've got reproduction and distribution. That's one for many things you've got to think about with humanity. Humanity, we can greed sometimes. That's why we have stewardship. There is a disagreement between scientists, environmentalists, politicians, and social scientists. Hence, the following chapters investigate how the relationship between human populations and common resources is understood, debated, politicised, and managed. Three important and related issues underpin this investigation of common resources. The first is the question of how boundaries become established between what is called the natural, a term often associated with the resources just described, and the social, commonly used to evoke a separate and distinct consideration of humans and human activity, such as the consumption of these resources. The idea of the clear division between nature and society is one that is increasingly called into question by social scientists. Second, it is important to consider some other observations and theories generated by social scientists in thinking about the long-standing challenges and debates over the use of common resources in particular. The tragedy of the commons. This term is most commonly associated with the work of the US environmental scientist Garrett Hardin, 1968, which highlights the tendency for commonly available resources to be overused and depleted. The key principle is one person's gain is overusing a resource imposes losses that are shared out among many others. Once this overuse becomes common practice, it becomes increasingly difficult to offset. This is illustrated by Hardin through the example of farmers grazing increased numbers of privately owned cows on common pasture. Third, the theme of rights explores in the context of the distinct but related disciplines of environmental studies, politics and international relations, economics and geography. Joining these different disciplines highlights the rights are only claimed and contested, but they emerge in various and often overlapping forms, including property rights, environmental rights, human rights, rights for nature, or the rights of non-human world. This introductory chapter will consider the distinction made between understandings of the natural and the social, and how it can be helpful to think about limitations of the distinction. Introduce the relationship between common resources and population growth. Introduce the idea of rights, some of the key historical and political foundations for our understanding of rights and the contestations that have risen from them. Chapter 1, The Natural and the Social, on page 7. Making a distinction between the natural environment and the social environment affects how they are studied. The natural environment has largely been interpreted by natural scientists, the first of whom tended to range across all the disciplines that are now separate specialisms: biology, chemistry, physics, and geology, for example. The world has similarly become a focus for many different approaches to social science, such as economics, politics, and sociology, which develop different ways of thinking and talking about the social environment. These different approaches can be complementary, but they can also come into conflict. Policymakers in government or at the top of large organisations must often extract a common plan from competing ideas about opinions as available and their implications. However, these two environments can be thought of as interrelated rather than separate. The social environment arises from the presence of the actions of people, but also shapes what people think and do. Humans emerged from and have adapted to the natural environment, but it is increasingly being reshaped by human activity. Both environments, natural and social, affect what each person can do, constraining some activities and enabling others. Awareness of these environments requires each individual to consider how they and their actions relate to those around them. Understanding and, where necessary, combining these two worlds requires different viewpoints that can lead to different explanations and evaluations. Some social scientists go further and take a radical view about relations between the natural and the social worlds. For the sociologist and philosopher Bruno Latour, the distinction between natural and social is unhelpful and, he argues, fundamentally misguided. He points to the following example. On page 4 of my daily newspaper, I learned that measurements taken above the Antarctic are not good for this year. The hole in the ozone layer is growing ominously larger. A few paragraphs later, I come across heads of the state major industrialised countries who are getting involved with chemistry, refrigerators, aerosols, and inserted gases. But at the end of the article, I discover that the meteorologists don't agree with the chemists. Towards the bottom of the page, the third world and the ecologists add their grain of salt and talk about international treaties, moratoriums of the right of future generations, and the right to development. None of these consumable, yet they are caught up in the same story. Page 8, Introducing Common Resources and Rights. A certain essential concern from Latour is that opposing boundaries when thinking about the world, including the environment, can lead to a rather disappointed view. Latour's remark illustrates this by considering how the newspaper is organised into different sections, such as national, international, science, or business, for example. It shows how the story of the ozone depletion does not fit well into such neatly bounded interests. Latour argues that boundaries are often falsely constructed to distinguish between nature and society. The relationship between human populations and natural resources is not as straightforward as it might seem. It's not just a question of humans that consume on the one hand, and then common resources that are consumed on the other. Bruno Latour argues that boundaries are often falsely constructed to distinguish between nature and society. Activity 1. It uses the example of forests to help illustrate this viewpoint. On page 9, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about a forest? Make note of your thoughts. I always think about deforestation. That's what I always think about. Recycling and use of paper, use of wood. That's what I think about. The first word you wrote down may well have been trees, possibly also thought about a quiet, atmospheric place and the absence of humans. However, while a forest might commonly be thought of an isolated, atmospheric, and unpopulated place, there are many examples where forests have been used as places to live and subsist. In the global north, forests are also places of leisure walk, climb, or cycle, for example. The Black Forest in Germany or the New Forest in England are examples you may be familiar with. This range of uses forests as places to live, work, and participate in leisure disrupts the idea that a forest is entirely a natural thing. Instead, it suggests that the natural is also woven into livelihoods and practices of humans. Page 10. South Sea Forest and Forestry Commission site in North Hampshire, UK. The human influence in forests is also apparent in the work of organisations such as the Forestry Commission, which is responsible for managing and maintaining large areas of the Scottish and English forestry plantation, harvesting more than 4 million tonnes of wood each year. Forestry Commission 2014. These forests are perhaps more comparable with our agricultural fields. They are clearly sites of managed human production. And the organised planting, the feeling of these forests create visual patterns and structures distinct from what a natural forest might be expected to look like. What is perhaps less familiar is the notion of the forest without any trees at all. However, as the environmental historian Oliver Rackman points out, a forest, spelt with a capital F, is land on which the king or some other magnate has the right to keep deer. To the medievals, a forest was a place of deer, not a place of trees. If a forest happened to be wooded, it formed part of the wood pasture tradition, but there were many woodless forests. While forests can provide a clear example of a common resource, thinking about its different use helps to highlight the idea that such resources are bound up, not just in debates about the environment, but in political and economic decisions, power struggles between different groups, competing markets and disputed boundaries. One example is the continuing concern about and campaigns to prevent the depletion of the Amazon rainforest in South Africa. Natural resources do not sit outside the human world, but are bound up within. Not only is the natural element of this story difficult to untangle from the human element, but the struggles between humans about the use of common resources and the environment make it clear that humans are far more unified group. So the contentions over common resources are as much about a problematic relationship between humans as they are about a relationship between humans and the common resources they exploit. Over a number of centuries, a persistent theme has influenced the tensions between different groups over the use of these resources. That theme has a negative impact on the increasing human population. And Section 2 will use Harding's theory of the tragedy of the commons to explore the resulting pressure on common resources. Page 12, we have a summary. The social and the natural are often difficult to separate, and their distinction can be problematic. A more complex and entangled view of the social and the natural helps to inform a better understanding of the contestations and challenges that arise over common resources. Page 13. Tragedy of the commons. The relationship between a growing human population and the use of resources that everyone can freely access presents a very clear story of increasing pressure of demand. To think about this relationship in a little more detail, it might be useful to consider a specific tangible example of common resources which is most of us experience on a day-to-day basis. 2.1 Roads on page 13. Public roads, like any common resources, are freely available to use, but their continued and sustained use is not without consequences. The example of roads can help highlight two enduring issues that have been identified in respect of all common resources, their use and their management. Activity 2. Look at the picture in 1.5 of the M1 motorway in the UK taken during the 1960s. Is there anything about this picture that surprised you? In the discussion, in any contemporary picture on the same motorway, it would be almost impossible to capture in daylight, such as empty road. Indeed, people even complained when the UK government authorised the building of the first motorways, saying that there were scars across the countryside that only a few would ever use. You might also have noticed that there is no crash barrier in the central reservation, something which led to instances of early motorway users carrying out U-turns if they missed their intended exit junction. Page 14. Introducing common resource and rights still. Motorways exclude some groups such as walkers, cyclists and certain slow moving vehicles. However, most people can make use of them and everyone can use other types of public road. As car ownership increased, available road space became scarcer and journey times went up. By the 1990s, some city planners were becoming concerned about gridlock. So many cars and trucks were joining the same roads simultaneously that nothing could move, with even emergency vehicles getting stuck for hours. Roads have joined a growing number of common resources that once seemed to have sufficient capacity for everyone, but now suffer congestion and degradation because of unrestricted use and a rising number of vehicles and journeys. The issue or problem is an instance of what Harding 1968 called the tragedy of the commons. This refers to a situation where increasing use of resource starts to deplete. It's so that the arrival of the next user leaves a little less for every existing user. The tragedy arises when a resource is non-exploitable, accessible and available to everyone, and exhaustible, limited in supply, so what one person takes becomes available to others. This idea is explored further in chapter 4. Because instances of the tragedy has become more frequent, affecting them among other things, the world's forests, energy and water supplies, marine resources, farmland, and even the atmosphere. Preventing and resolving it has become a major policy concern. Returning to the example of roads, can you think of which way in which governments and other organisations have tried to reduce the problem of non-excludability, where it is not possible to exclude people from using them? The motorist tragedy of the commons is that the roads are not open as they once were. Some classes of vehicles are excluded from larger roads or confined to one lane. Tolls or congestion charges have been imposed on some roads to deter vehicles from using them. Parking has been restricted or banned in many places, or is charged for where it is used to be free. Residents of some streets get traffic calming installed to deter traffic from entering, or at least to slow it down. In each case, the accessibility and availability of the resource are restricted in some way. Background to the tragedy. Resourcing a growing population. Increasing usage of resources is often related to population growth. Figure 1.6 tracks the growth of in population of the UK from the 9th century to the beginning of the 21st century. And in the beginning of this period, the UK population was approximately the same as that of the present day, Greater Manchester 2.7 million, ONS 2014, and it now stands at over 20 times this figure, 65 million in 2014. This significant population increases over the centuries in a trend replicated in many other parts of the world. Global population was estimated 700 million, 7 billion, 7,000 million, 7 billion. 2014, up from around 2.5 billion in 1950 and 6 billion in 2000. World meters, NDA. Whether such a population increase can be sustained by the depth resources is a contentious question. Some people believe that there is an ultimate limit on the number of human lives that can be resourced by the earth. Other people argue that technological developments leading to increased agriculture yields and improved energy efficiency, along with adaptations human consumption patterns, make the former argument outdated and inaccurate. These can be called pessimistic and optimistic viewpoints. respectively. The population growth and food. The pessimistic view of the population growth and its danger for all humankind is not new. It was famously expressed in Thomas Malthus' essay on the principles of the population, 1798. Malthus not only identified the importance of population growth, but drew some very clear conclusions about its causes and effects. He wrote, I say, that the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man. Population, when unchecked, increases a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in a arithmetical ratio. A slight acquaintance with numbers will mean show. The immensity of the first power in comparison of the second. Malthus foresaw impending disaster because of the relationship between the geometrical progression 1, 2, 4, 8, which he associates with population growth. Arithmetical progression of 1, 2, 3, 4, which he associates with food production growth. If humanity survived at all, it would only be because periodic pestilence and war would cut the population back down to level that could be supported by a slow-growing food supply. The view of dangerous, inexorable population growth and the fear that it will inevitably outstrip food supply is often described as Malthusianism. In spite of that pessimism, food production has tended to grow more rapidly than Malthus predicted. For example, the introduction of high-yield varieties in the 1960s allowed India to become self-sufficient in grain, even as its population was growing rapidly, despite frequently voiced concerns that intensive farming will eventually deplete and erode the soil so that the production drops, or the monocultures of high-yield food plants will be suddenly wiped out by disease. Most countries, food production has continued to grow in most years. India's food grain production in 2014 was 35% higher than 2000. Reserve Bank in India, 2014. Amartya Sen, a prominent Indian social scientist, has assembled evidence that the past famines occurred because food was inadequately distributed, not because there was not enough to go round. Sen, 1990. Population growth has also showed in many countries, even leveling off or declining in some. For example, India's population grew by 20% in the period of 1985 to 94, 16% in 1995 to 2000, and 12% in 2015 to 2014. The world meters. This slowdown was achieved in part by controversial sterilisation campaigns, which coerced women to volunteer by offering financial incentives. Birth 2014. China, the only other country whose population exceeds 1 billion, attempted to restrict family sizes by law, introducing its one child only policy in the 1980s. Such campaigns and policies raise the issue of relationship between rights and responsibilities. A relationship that is explored further in Section 3. Harding model of the tragedy of the commons illustrates the way common resources can become depleted through overuse, a process influenced by the lure of private gain. The rapid population growth of recent centuries has been a bearing on the use and management of common resources. In the late 18th century, Thomas Malthus put forward the argument that population world outstrip food production. This view has since been challenged. Rights and responsibilities. A useful place to start considering the concept of rights is The Rights of Man, written by the radical political thinker Thomas Paine, 1737-1809. Over 2 volumes in 1971, 1792, Paine was a strong defender of the rural poor, who had continued to be marginalised in an increasingly industrialised agricultural environment. He is also a keen supporter of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, and the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, and later settled in the United States as a citizen. The political activity in France and America influenced a great deal of radical writing at the time, much of which centred on the rights of socially marginalised. Another key text at the same time was a vindication of the rights of women, written by Mary Wollstonecraft and published in 1792, a work that is commonly regarded as the foundational feminist text. Paine outlines its position in the following statement. If any generation of men ever possessed the right to dictating the mode by which the world should be governed forever, it was the first generation that exists. And if that generation did not, no succeeding generation can shew any authority for doing it, nor can it set any up. The illuminating and divine principle on the equal rights of man, for it has its origins from the maker of man, relates not only to the living individual, but no generation of men succeed each over. Every generation is equal rights to the generations which precede it, by the same rule that every individual is born equal in rights with his contemporary. The wording of Paine's quote is a little archaic, and you may need to read it more than once. What do you think these key ideas are? A central concern of Paine is the rights of what are now often referred to as future generations. A common preoccupation to contemporary social and environmental scientists in considering the sustainable management on common resources. Paine is concerned that the mode by which the world should be governed is not something for any single generation to decide upon, but that each generation, each individual is born equal in rights. A simpler or a more familiar expression of the view is to say that each person is only a temporary steward of the planet and has a responsibility to maintain it for future generations. The other key aspect of Paine's view is the equal rights of man, and that each person can make an equal claim to be heard. This is the foundation for an important way of understanding rights as something to be asserted, claimed, or even fought for. A little earlier than Paine, the 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, asserted that society can be only function on the basis of what we called the social contract. The basis of this idea was that the individuals of societies were codependent, and that the rights of individual could only be claimed once the individual submitted to the idea of the society, or as Rousseau put it, alienation to the whole community of each with all his rights. Since each gives himself up entirely, the condition or are equal for all. Rousseau, 1998 to 1763, page 15. The idea of the social contract has also had great currency in contemporary British politics and was popularly evoked in New Labour's 1997 election manifesto, where it was stated that rights and responsibilities must go hand in hand. The Labour Party in 1997. In other words, rights must be earned, and earned through taking responsibility place in society for the benefit of all within it. Thank you so much. I've not got much more to read. 3 more pages, I'm with you. Jean-Jacques Rousseau left, and Tony Blair, leader of the New Labour, 1997. Human rights and property rights. Among the rights that Paine, Wollstonecraft and Rousseau addressed, property rights have been especially contentious and central debates about inequality. Yeah, I always do. Yeah, I do. Almost everyone through there are dissenters accepts the concept of self-ownership, people's entitlement to their own body, including the right to exercise any special physical or mental talent that it might bring them. Please wait, I want to talk to you after you don't mind. Few cultures have any issue with their idea of people owning small numbers of personal items. However, when it comes to owning large tracts of land or sums of money, societies and social scientists differ widely over what is appropriate. Ideas about property rights from exhibit a distinction and tension between the natural and social worlds, introduced in section 1. In many societies, it is viewed as reasonable and important for social order that people who have bought a house, a car, or a phone should have rights over it and be able to exclude others from using it. Yet many question whether someone who owns a forest or a large tract of land should have the same exclusive rights, and some would question whether these should be privately owned at all. This issue famously highlighted in 1932 when a group of ramblers conducted a mass trespass in 𝕸𝕚𝕚𝕚 in the Peak District, an act which is regarded as highly significant in leading to improved access to rights of way in the British countryside. Property can be categorised as private, belonging to one person or family; common, belonging to a whole community; or public, assigned to the government or state. Public property is managed on the public behalf, but the state can impose the same exclusions as a private owner. You can walk freely on a common, but not on all government-owned land. Private, common, and public are mutually exclusive categories. Many types of property fit into more than one, or move between them in different circumstances. A shopping centre might look like a common resource, but it is usually owned by a private company that can restrict access to it. Privately owned property can be subject to compulsory purchase if needed for public purpose, such as building a new airport or railway. Property rights are also rarely absolute, in the sense of owners being able to do anything they please with their property. Their use is circumscribed by a whole range of laws and rules that restrict the owner's rights, and usually also impose some obligations. With social scientists argue that private property rights are universal and should even be recognised among basic human rights. Others view them as much more culturally and historically specific, not everyone is comfortable with. And some try to prevent large private accumulation of land, buildings, and other material wealth. Concept of private property can change over time within societies. For example, Western countries abandoned slavery in the 19th century, but until then, even people could be regarded as private property, and slave owners were compensated from their loss of slaves when slavery was abolished. As the examples highlight, property rights and human rights are not neatly and easily defined and complicated by different social, cultural, and historical influences. And this has led to them being deeply contested, just as Thomas Paine suggested that future generations are essential to our understanding of preservation of rights. It is plight of those future generations that also guides ideas and debates about the use and stewardship of common resources. The rights of man and the rights of environment are connected through debates about access, equality, and responsibility. Whether these are seen as a concern of individuals, communities, governments, industries, or international organisations. In a summary, a contemporary understanding of stewardship is formed by Thomas Paine's 18th century view of rights, where each person has a responsibility to maintain the environment for future generations. This highlights the connection between rights and responsibilities and the relationship between an individual and society. Specific rights are often hard to define and came into conflict with one another, as illustrated in the relationship between human rights and property rights. We're going to leave that little bit of reading there. Thank you for being so patient. Page 24, we got to page 24.